In this video, I'm going to take you through the poem Remains by Simon Armitage. You can use this video to start writing your own notes on the poem or to start developing the notes that you've already written as you've been studying these poems. It's important to remember that this poem, despite the fact that it's a dramatic monologue, so it's written in first person, is not actually Simon Armitage's own experience. Armitage wrote poetry for a documentary on Channel 4 called The Not Dead about service people who've left the armed forces and the effect that the armed forces and their experiences had upon them. So it's worthwhile, if you get a chance, to look on YouTube for that documentary. It's about an hour long, I believe, and you can actually see the soldier that this poem in particular was written about. So I'm going to read through the poem for you now, and then we'll start building up some of those annotations bit by bit. Remains by Simon Armitage. On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire, three of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body, and he's carted off on the back of a lorry. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week, and then I'm home on leave. But I blink, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed, and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead, in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. When we're looking at poetry, it's really important to consider the title. So make sure that you're not just skimming over this, and really think about what the impact of the title is. So we could be thinking about the idea of things being left after other parts have been taken away, used up or destroyed. The soldier themselves being almost used up by their country. They're a product of war, of course. Myself and somebody else and somebody else. We get the sense that their autonomy has been taken away from them, and they are all the same. They've been moulded the same for their one purpose. Possibly, the remains that we're talking about are going to be the remains of the memory of the event, guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder. We get the sense of that from the line, dug in behind enemy lines. That idea of the guilt being almost like a parasite within the mind of the speaker. We could also be talking about the literal death of the looter. As you can see from definition 2, the dead body or parts of a dead body. Well, the remains of somebody are spoken about within this poem. His blood shadow stays on the street. It's there as a reminder for the speaker about what they have done. Or finally, we could be thinking about the metaphorical death of the soldier. He is broken. We can see that he tries to self-medicate. The drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He can't get rid of that memory, no matter how hard he tries. So we're going to go through the poem now bit by bit and think about the language and structure of each of the stanzas as we go through. Right at the beginning of the poem, we get the sense that the poem is anecdotal. It's like a story. You'll have heard the term in medias res, which is the sense of being dropped into the action. That actually creates a kind of unstable opening within this poem. It isn't a poem that is one where we understand the beginning, middle and end necessarily. It feels like we have come in on in the middle of a conversation and we're just kind of picking up this story as someone is telling it. So we are observers to this story. It's possibly reflective of the fact that soldiers have quite a disjointed and chaotic life, and so we're experiencing that sense of the disjointed nature of a soldier's life. In this first sentence as well, we got sent out. We get that sense again of the lack of autonomy. Soldiers have very little free will, and they don't actually get to make their own decisions very much. And this we can make connections with some of the other poems. Charge of the Light Brigade springs to mind. That idea of people just following orders. Perhaps they're not really thinking about the decisions that they're having to make. Perhaps they're just following those orders and then not really thinking about the consequences, of those decisions that they have to make. Armitage very effectively uses colloquialisms within his poem, within many of his poems, and this one it's particularly effective. Colloquialisms is that kind of slang, authentic accent or dialect of the speaker. And so we can see here where he says one of them legs it up the road, and then in the second stanza there at the end where it says I swear. This gives us a real feeling for the voice of the speaker. We sense that this is a real person, and it's someone actually telling us or confessing to us what has happened to them, rather than us feeling quite separate. We actually invest in this speaker and start to identify perhaps with them as well as the poem goes on. Certainly sympathise with them. At the end of the first stanza, we get this very powerful quotation, probably armed, possibly not. So a description of that looter. And we get a sense that the speaker is uncertain. They're uncertain as to what the situation is. But because it's all happening so fast, they're having to make that decision quite quickly as to whether they're going to chase after them, whether they're going to let them go, whether they're going to shoot at them, what happens. And so this sense of uncertainty that we get here, this is the thing that's returned to a bit later on in the poem. And that echo that we hear later in the poem is the thing that actually causes the guilt, or certainly manifests as guilt within the speaker. They don't know. The situation is that they don't know whether that person posed a threat to them or not. And so that's what they keep turning over and over again in their mind. In the second stanza, it's quite interesting the way that Armitage uses collective phrases, I've called them here. Myself and somebody else and somebody else. So that's one collective phrase. We're all of the same mind, another collective phrase. All three of us, open fire, so another. And then this other one here, three of a kind. So these collective phrases possibly are a way of the speaker almost trying to deflect blame. They're saying it wasn't just me, it was all of us. We all felt the same way. It wasn't just me by myself. I'm not individually responsible. And so at this point in the poem, we get the sense maybe that the speaker is trying to justify what happened. And so they do feel guilt, but perhaps they're suggesting that it's not just their fault. It's other people that also were involved within this. Throughout this poem, there's a number of violent images, but I'm going to speak about them in different ways. So at this point, I want us to focus on the violent verb here. I see every round as it rips through his life. So rip as a violent verb, it really does convey the horror that the speaker feels at the moment. And also, it conveys to us the fact that they are visualising what's happened. Rip is also onomatopoeic, so you can almost imagine the violent sound that it makes as it goes through the body. So it's quite sensory, this line here, and it's grotesque sensory imagery. So you could talk about it in terms of being a verb, you can talk about it in terms of being onomatopoeic, you can talk about it in terms of the imagery that it conveys, however you like, but it's a really easy word for us to remember, and there's lots you can say about it. This word here is metaphorical, actually. I see every round as it rips through his life. So rather than saying it rips through his body, the speaker uses the word life. And I think that that's there to convey that the soldier recognises that the enormity of taking a life, that it's something that has changed him. It's not something that he's going to forget. It's not something that is can be forgotten, that is small. It's something really significant. And so that metaphorical use of life there, rather than body, is really important. And then at this point, at the end of stanza 3, we get this change in tense. There's a shift to present tense. Rather than saying we got sent out, like it says at the beginning of the poem, it says he's there on the ground, he is there on the ground. So by doing that, by changing the tense here, Armitage is conveying that the speaker is almost reliving what happened. The memory is so vivid that it's like he's there having that same experience over and over again. And so as the poem progresses, we start to understand that this is a traumatic cycle that the speaker goes through over and over again. It's something that's really tormenting them and causing them to suffer. And then again, this is obviously connected to the violent verb at the beginning of stanza 3. At the end of stanza 3 here and the beginning of stanza 4, sort of inside out, pain itself, the image of agony. Really interesting use of language here, because it's not metaphorical, I don't think, when it says sort of inside out. I think that it's probably quite literal. That's probably quite close to what actually the soldier could see. But I think that those three phrases all suggest to us that the speaker is actually finding it quite difficult to express the horror of what they saw. It's something almost that they found quite hard to comprehend. Remember, this is the first time that this person has ever had to kill anyone. And so it really is a significant moment in their life and something that they're finding it quite hard to articulate. And then we get this really quite jarring juxtaposition between this quite poetic pain itself, the image of agony at the beginning of that stanza, to this next idea, one of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. It's a kind of casual, careless movement that suggests that this tidying up of dead bodies, this kind of cleaning up of death is commonplace. And that's actually quite shocking in itself. The kind of casualness of it is quite shocking. Perhaps it shows a disregard for human life, a disrespect, but perhaps it just shows that this is something that is so commonplace that the people who are there have become numb to this experience. At the beginning of this stanza, again, I think this is a really interesting and useful quotation to try and memorise. End of story, except not really. The body, the physical reminder of the death, is gone. But actually, at this point now, even though the soldier might believe that once it's kind of out of sight, then he'll be able to forget it, he can't. He actually now needs to face the emotional consequences of his actions, which we'll find out as the poem progresses are much more significant than any physical consequences. There are no physical consequences for him. He's essentially followed orders and done what he's supposed to do, but the emotional consequences are severe. We get this blood shadow here, which connects very closely to a war photographer. We hear about the blood staining into foreign dust within war photographer. This is a really good connection in terms of imagery. His blood shadow stays on the street and out on patrol. I walk right over it week after week. This is again that sense of him having to relive the experience. He's almost condemned to relive it at this point. It's like a kind of purgatory for him. He has to keep on going through that same cycle of going past the evidence of the person that he's killed. And then this bit which moves into the next stanza, but I blink, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed, possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. That the rule of three there, blink, sleep and dream, that idea suggests this kind of flashbacks that the speaker is having, that they're unexpected, but I blink, sleep, dream. Those are all things that you have to do out of necessity. But also that means that while they're unexpected, these flashbacks, they're also inescapable. You can't stop yourself from sleeping. You definitely can't stop yourself from blinking. And so whenever these things happen, these flashbacks invade his kind of sense of perspective and are really destructive in terms of his emotional, mental health. And then, as I said earlier, we get this line, he's probably armed and possibly not. It's connected, this echo that we've heard from earlier, the repetition of this exact sentence, the soldier's being tortured by his doubt. He doesn't know whether the person that he has killed was actually posing a threat to him. And so he has to constantly go back over and say, was he dangerous? Wasn't he dangerous? Should I have killed him? Should I have not killed him? And so that is the kind of cycle that is causing his mental decline. And then this line here at the end of this stanza, the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. It shows the attempts that the soldier has had to try and forget. It shows that he has resorted to, we call it self-medicating. It's a euphemism for drinking alcohol, taking drugs, in order to kind of escape from the suffering that he's going through, the mental suffering that he's going through. But we know that it's futile, this attempt, because it says the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's not succeeding in escaping. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines. The memory itself of what he's done is like an enemy soldier. So this is obviously metaphorical. There's nothing actually in his head physically, but he describes it as if it's some sort of like a cancer or a parasite or something that is dug in, something that is wedged in his mind, something that is refusing to leave, and something that is causing damage, dug in behind enemy lines, is waiting to assassinate him, almost, mentally. Not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land. So we know that he wants to forget, but he can't. It's actually ironic that with the ease that the body was just kind of tossed into the back of a lorry and carted away, the ease with that body being kind of disappeared from him, if you like, it's ironic that the actual memory is hanging around so long and is so persistent within his mind because the body was cleared up so easily. And then we get this final short stanza at the end. Near to the knuckle, here and now. Those two phrases together kind of suggest this immediacy of the feelings, the desperation that he feels. Near to the knuckle sounds kind of raw. It sounds like there's tension. It sounds like there's a kind of, it's coming to a climax or a peak. The speaker is on the edge of their sanity. They probably can't go on for much longer. And then this final line, his bloody life in my bloody hands. You can call this a literary allusion. So it's connected to Macbeth, the Shakespeare play, about the idea of Lady Macbeth going mad towards the end of the play, because she, after they have committed their crimes, their murders, she hallucinates that she still has blood on her hands, physical blood, tries to wash it off and cannot wash it off. She says, "Will these hands ne'er be clean?" So she can't wash her hands clean. It's representative of the guilt that she feels. There's also further literary allusions within this poem. The blink, sleep, dream could also be connected to Macbeth as well. The idea of Macbeth can sleep no more, the fact that he is so guilty and feels so guilty of the crimes that he's committed that he kind of perceives that someone is talking to him, telling him that he will never sleep again, but it actually is his own conscience. So we get this sense that the speaker of the poem, due to this literary allusion, they'll never escape the torture of the memory. We know that in Macbeth, both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth end up dead, and so perhaps that is the sense of finality that's being created at the end of the poem, something that is inescapable. I hope that this video has been useful for you, and I hope that you can build up some of your notes confidently now. Obviously, please do look for other videos as well to help support you, and keep working hard and making connections between those poems. Good luck, guys.